So Jules Boykoff, according to the latest figures I've seen, the LA 2028 Olympics are projected to cost about $6.9 billion. What do you think the percentage chance is of that number rising significantly between now and 2028?
Well, just based on the political history of the Olympics, the chance of that figure rising is 100%. I mean, the study out of Oxford University that looked at every Olympics between 1960 and the Tokyo Games of 2020 found that every single Olympics went over budget. And so I'd say the chances are pretty good. After all, when they were pitching those Olympics in Los Angeles in the first place, they said they'd be $5.3 billion. Well, here only a few years later, we're at $6.9 billion.
What happens in these cities when money, like when they have to wind up spending all this money that they didn't necessarily plan to spend on Olympic cost overruns? What doesn't get paid for?
Yeah, that's a great question that a lot of people in Olympic city after Olympic city have been asking themselves. And in short, what we're talking about is what economists refer to as opportunity costs. If you're going to spend money on an admittedly optional yet amazing complex phenomenon like the Olympics, you're not spending money on other things. When I was in Tokyo just a few years ago, that was one of the main complaints, was that all this money being spent on the Olympics could have been bolstering the educational system. And in fact, the students in Tokyo were given sort of a steady diet of Olympic propaganda that only looked at the positive sides and didn't give chance to the students to think critically about those games. So it can cut even deeper, really, when you start thinking about where that money is going and not going.
And so then what makes hosting the Olympics worthwhile for cities like Los Angeles, cities like Tokyo?
Well, it's interesting because it's true that fewer and fewer cities are game to host the Olympic Games. There's no getting around that. Between 2013 and 2018, more than a dozen cities just said no to the Olympics. Why do they keep bidding on them? Well, it's because the political elites and economic elites in the city do know that they can benefit from the Olympic Games. Let's not forget that there is a lot of money swishing through the Olympic system. It just tends to swish upwards into already full pockets. So if you're a well-positioned politico, as was the case of Eric Garcetti in Los Angeles, you can benefit from the Olympics. You can bet that when he was trying to become the ambassador to India, he was telling anyone who would listen that he brought the Olympic Games to Los Angeles. This was seen as a feather in his political cap. Let's not forget about those construction barons in each one of these Olympic cities that also benefit from the Olympic Games. And so basically the Olympics have become sort of an example of trickle up economics. And that's why you see cities continue to bid on them, because there is money to be made.
Now, Jules, I don't know about you, but I am old enough to remember the most recent Olympics in Los Angeles. I was a young child when it happened, but 1984. And one of the things we remember about that Olympics was that it was heavily subsidized by corporate sponsorship. And then the other thing we remember is that, if correct me if my facts are wrong, but this was one of the few Olympics in the modern era not to run up a huge debt. And one of the reasons was that a lot of these facilities already existed. How does that outlook look this time for 2028? Are we still looking at a scenario where the Los Angeles Olympics might not lose money, even with this huge budget, because facilities are already there and because there's going to be so much corporate sponsorship?
You're so right, Morgan, to raise the issue of the 1984 Olympics, because they've been ghosting behind this entire project of the 2028 Games from the beginning. Two of the biggest proponents of the 2028 Olympics, Mayor Eric Garcetti and Casey Wasserman, who's heading the bid, are known colloquially around Los Angeles and certainly in Olympic circles as the 1984 boys. Both of them attended the 1984 Olympics, said how wonderful they were, totally enjoyed them, had great tickets to attend the event, and had a darn good time. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, and I've done dozens and dozens of interviews of people who were in Los Angeles at that time. And one trend that I noticed, people who were in Los Angeles in 1984, if they tend to be white and if they tend to be rich, they had a great time at those Olympics. Racialized communities, Black and brown communities in Los Angeles, don't quite have the same sanguine memory of Los Angeles. The people I talked to looked back at 1984 and thought about the helicopters that were flying overhead. They thought about the fact that the Los Angeles Police Department used the opportunity to multiply its weapon stocks and then turned around after those Olympics and also during them to heavily repress these Black and brown communities. So what I'm suggesting to you is 1984 is really important in terms of understanding the general sentiments about the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. But the spirit of those sentiments is heavily racialized.
Now, Jules, I read an article, an op-ed you wrote for the Los Angeles Times recently, and you quoted Allison Felix from Los Angeles, really decorated Olympic athlete, and her talking about her role in this Los Angeles bid process and her feeling kind of disillusioned with how disempowered athletes are in all of this. So when you think of a more equitable Olympic future, what role do athletes themselves have to play?
You know, I think we are living in what we fairly can call the athlete empowerment era. And this has definitely affected the Olympic Games. Let me just give you some statistics from a recent report that was done by a group called Global Athlete in conjunction with Toronto Metropolitan University. What they did was they looked at the amount of money that was coming to Olympic athletes compared to other sports like the NFL, the NBA, the Premier League of English football or soccer, the NHL. And what they found with those other professional leagues, athletes were directly receiving between 45 and 60% of the revenues, 45 and 60. With the Olympics, it was 4.1% is what athletes were getting directly. And many scales have fallen from many eyes when it comes to Olympic athletes. It's not just Allison Felix, it's many athletes, and they are starting to organize right now. I mentioned Global Athlete, which is kind of this international hub for some of this organizing, but we're also seeing it inside of individual sports like track and field, for example, or swimming, where athletes are coming together and essentially forming de facto unions to stand up for their rights. And for me, that's a really exciting development in all this. And I think it's something for us all to keep an eye on moving forward.
Okay, perfect. That was Jules Boykoff, political science professor at Pacific University in Portland, Oregon. Jules, thanks so much for having taken the time to be with us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Aaron, that sound good?